It never occurred to me that my history of fetishistic cross-stitching was compatible with the identity of a trans woman. If you're a diaper-wearing, age-play, fetishistic, walking in the mall, sucking on a baby bottle, should, a fully intact male like Leah Thomas be able to walk into a single-sex changing room and just get naked? Because there's a sort of like idea in gender identity theory that, if you have a certain gender identity, you are more or less, for all intents and purposes, like perfectly equivalent to a female. Why don't males get their own space for breastfeeding? It is okay to repress like a desire.
Does it cause you distress?
Welcome, Ray, to the Jack.jewell podcast. You are my third guest. So thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to our interview. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to the conversation. So, where should we start?
Yeah, so I've been following you on YouTube as well. And for anyone watching, I'll put Ray's details in the description. Please go check him out. Find your videos super interesting. You approach them from a very scientific angle, and the whole topic of the transgender typology and autogynephilia really fascinates me. So yeah, I guess you're a detransition male, right? So if you kind of like to introduce yourself and explain a little bit about that.
Sure. So, when I was 28 years old, I transitioned. I adopted the identity of a trans woman, essentially, that kind of eventually evolved into, a trans feminine identity. But, the origin of all that, and I should say that whole period of my life lasted 8 years, and I took hormones. Didn't have any surgeries or anything, but I was taking hormones for 8 years, and then last summer I detransitioned. But the sort of impetus, sort of looking back on sort of my whole life story, like what brought me to that point when I was 28 years old, and I decided, like, hey, this is something I want to do. I now understand myself to having AGP, autogynephilia, which, depending on how people classify this or talk about it, it is essentially, a paraphilia. It's some people call it a fetish. And that started when I was very young. And there's different types of AGP. So for some people, it's more focused on, the anatomy. So, or
Yeah.
for some, it's about clothing. For me, it was mostly about the clothing aspect. So when I was very, very young, even prior to puberty, I was very fascinated by women's clothing. And, the reasons why that happened, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's partly innate, partly environmental, kind of the nature and nurture kind of working together. I don't really know the true origin, but nevertheless, I had this fascination. It was really fetishistic. It was particularly focused on like one particular type of clothing when I was younger, which was hosiery. And then
Okay.
that kind of like escalated as I got older, and then high school, it kind of like, got more and more elaborate. But for those that don't know, autogynephilia is essentially like arousal at the thought of oneself as a woman. And that takes on, different characteristics. Like you can be aroused at the thought of yourself having female anatomy, or, wearing women's clothing, or a combination of multiple factors. And then, for many, many years, I just identified as a cross-dresser. And then when I was 28, my wife left me for reasons unrelated to, um, you know, uh, the gender stuff. I kind of
Yeah.
suppressed my gender feelings during my marriage for the sake of the marriage. But once that
Mm,
marriage fell apart, um, I was in grad school. I had no other responsibilities or anything. So I was just like, hey, let's explore this gender thing. And, I kind of, cross-dressed more and more and more, which led to kind of full-time cross-dressing. And then I was in therapy at the time. And this was like 2015. It was the height of the trans tipping point. And so Caitlyn
mm,
Jenner was big in the news. Like Laverne Cox was big in the news. Like trans women were like a big social thing. And, the therapist sort of said, like, hey, you should watch Caitlyn Jenner's story because, it
mm.
reminds me of your cross-dressing and stuff. And it never occurred to me that my history of fetishistic cross-dressing was compatible with the identity of a trans woman. But, you know, um,
Yeah.
I started doing research on Reddit, and it turns out that a lot of trans women share similar um, life histories, but they'll just, it's very common in the community to ask questions like, is it just a fetish? And the answer is always, no, it's not just a fetish. Like, really just a woman, and these, fetishistic aspects are basically, your womanhood is there all along, and then you're just repressing that, and the only outlet is through your sexuality. But once you sort of like adopt a trans identity, then the fetish stuff goes away, and then it's like proof that you're really trans or something like this. So that was kind of like the long and short of it. Of like,
Yeah.
but there's way more I can go into it, but that's kind of just like
No, of course.
brief introduction to AGP and like what was the impetus. But obviously, this is very controversial because most trans people consider autogynephilia to be a pseudoscientific, transphobic, debunked, theory
Yeah.
that's made up by, basically terrible old white men who don't know what they're talking about and just hate trans people.
I've heard the same. Um, well, thanks so much for sharing that. Personally, I really do find this subject fascinating, and I think maybe one of the reasons is because it's prevalent. It's rare, of course, but it's not so rare that you'll meet someone in a blue moon with it. It's actually happening among us, and society by and large just are not aware of this. I feel it really goes under the radar, and I feel like when we talk about trans rights and trans people, there would be very few, average non-LGBT people or even LGBT people who know about this. So I want to come back to that, but I guess going back to the start, I notice online people can be very hostile about AGP, judgmental, especially, the gender critical feminists and that kind of stuff. But I guess imagining what young boys go through, and am I right in saying that it kind of came to light at puberty, adolescence?
I mean, I think there was, what I would say is there was a sort of like seed, there was sort of like a disposition that was there prior to puberty, but it didn't really
Yeah.
fully manifest. It didn't sort of take on its full, development until
Mm,
I was, went through puberty. And then, once the testosterone is like surging through your body, once you
yeah.
become more sexual. And I also think this is not talked about a lot in the trans community, but the influence of pornography on the development of these things, which is, I think, under talked about in the discourse. But I do think that played a factor insofar as, I eventually, I think it was in high school, I stumbled upon um, pornography about trans women. And that sort of like kicked off a um, lifelong fascination. And so, I mean, I sort of, I don't watch, I've kind of given up pornography, but that was something that like persisted for a long time, and I think it played a role in the development of this in terms of like escalating it, because
Yeah.
the way AGP operates is you sort of it's a form of heterosexuality that's inverted inward. So you're attracted to women, you're attracted to femininity, but you're constantly asking this question like, am I attracted to you, or do I want to be you? Whereas with the
Mm,
trans porn thing, there's another form of it that is not just attraction to females and wanting to be a female, but attraction to trans women in a fetishistic way and wanting to be a trans woman. So I think this explains the sort of difference between some trans women are really driven to get bottom surgery because the thing they want to be is a female. And there's other trans people like myself who the thing that we wanted to be was trans women, who are preoperative. And that sort of, led to the fact that I never had a desire for bottom surgery.
right.
Um,
Okay.
yeah. And
Interesting.
that has a specific form. So there are some men who have a fetishistic attraction to trans women. And the term
Yeah.
for that is Gynandromorphophilia, which is like attraction to that specific morphology of basically, a woman's body with feminine characteristics, but you have male genitals. And
Yeah.
then the sort of autogynephilic version of that is like Autogynandromorphophilia. So you want to be that thing that you're attracted to. So it's sort of
Mm.
like an inversion of your sexuality, essentially.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I was going to come to that point because I've heard of Gynandromorphophilia, if if I'm saying it right. Do you think these two
I,
things are
I, I
very
just call it GAMP. Like it's like a
GAMP,
mouthful. It's like
AGP and
GAMP
GAMP?
and a GAMP. Yeah.
Um, like, are these two things on some sort of a spectrum? If you have GAMP, are you more likely to be AGP or vice versa?
So Phil Illy, who is a AGP man, I'm not sure you probably seen some of his work, right?
We've spoken actually. I think
Oh
I'll have him
yeah,
as
okay,
well.
oh
So
great.
yeah,
Um, so I have his book, which I really recommend as far as like the
yeah,
scientific
I want to read
literature
that.
on this topic, and he looks at some research that shows that if you are GAMP, you are more likely to be AGP as well. So it's kind of like the flip side of the coin. Not all GAMPs are AGP, but if you are GAMP, you have a higher likelihood of being AGP, which is why it's very common. Trans women report this experience all the time. Is like they'll sort of like find a quote unquote straight man who is into them and willing to date them. And then, like, 6 months into dating them, they transition because they are sort of attracted to the trans women via the fetish or the of GAMP, but it's really just like a way to get closer to the thing that they want to be themselves, but they're just repressing that until they finally sort of like get inspired. I mean, it happened to me like when I was like identifying as trans. I like dated a guy, and
Yeah.
he eventually went on to become a she. So
Oh, right. I see. So you were already a trans woman and you dated a guy who was gynandromorphophilic.
I would assume so. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my guess. Like
And then, something I always wonder is you say AGP people are attracted to women and attracted to themselves being a woman, but did you also feel attraction towards men, or is it more this sort of meta, how they make
it
you
was
feel?
meta. It was very meta. So growing up, I was pretty much exclusively attracted to girls and women. Like I didn't really have any sort of bi curiosity or anything like this. But then once I
Right.
transitioned, um, it I developed a sort of meta like attraction. And I saw this many times where there would be like, trans women in, my local support group communities who, have been like married, 3 kids, like been like, heterosexual identified for like 50 years. And then they
I feel
like
like that's the
transition
classic example, by the way. Sorry to interrupt, but
yeah.
it's like
And
that
then
pattern
then
of
they
men taking their wives.
yeah, yeah. Which is interesting. I'll get to that later with like my own wife because we actually met while I was transitioned,
Okay.
my like current wife, and then I detransitioned. So I kind of like trans widowed in the reverse direction. like I like but it anyway, like these trans women who had basically, been straight identified for their entire lives as men, they suddenly transition and now they're all of a sudden boy crazy and so there's this idea that like somehow estrogen can change your sexual orientation, which I just don't
Right.
believe. I think it really is one of the it's like the pseudo bisexuality where you're using you're using the stereotypes around women being boy crazy to validate your womanhood because that is the preeminent thing that's important to the AGP is to validate the conception of yourself as a woman at all costs, no matter what. And so
Mm.
and there's kind of like some sort of like a conception that um, being boy crazy like is like proof positive of your true womanhood or something like this.
Yeah, that makes sense. And while it is that meta attraction, like, do you feel anything for their physicality? I mean, if I was imagining it, do they gross you out at all, like the guys, or Like, sorry to put it so
Um,
bluntly, but it's so hard to wrap my head around. Because
so the way,
if I had to sleep with a girl, um, even if that made me feel kind of more macho, I think I would be quite grossed out.
right. So this is how powerful AGP is because, I did have experiences with men sort of while I transitioned, and um, it was sort of like it, it's hard to explain, but like this sort of like gay porn never did it for me. Like the sort of like pure masculine image of like a masculine man with like facial hair. Like I was always more into like feminine men, which is I think explains why I was like into trans women who kind of fit that
Right. Yeah.
that category. But like stubble and kissing someone with stubble like was sort of like a turnoff for me.
Okay.
But these sort of like other aspects of like taking the submissive role was
Mm,
like, it was like very, I don't know, like, it was like a fantasy, I guess, that, I, played out. But for the most part, most of my dating experience when I was trans was with either, bi, women or with trans women.
mm,
Also dated a gold star lesbian at one point, which was interesting because I suspected that she was autoandrophilic. And because Phil
okay.
Illy talks about this interesting hypothesis that he thinks that AGPs are attracted to feminine or AGPs are attracted to feminine men, I think, and autoandrophiles are attracted to. It's like you're kind of attracted to the opposite version of yourself. As I
Yeah.
can't, I'm like totally
Can you just
butchering that, but
explain autoandrophilia for
it's
anyone listening?
basically the inverse of AGP. It's like females who sort of have a arousal at the thought of being men, but it's a contested term. It's a contested concept because some people will say that AGP is unique to the male brain because the
Right.
male brain has a it's sort of more it's much more common in males to have paraphilias and fetishes, whereas the female brain
Yeah.
just it's extremely rare for females to have that kind of like male typical paraphilic obsession.
Yeah.
Um, but I know Phil Illy has compiled a range of evidence, and even if autoandrophilia is not the same as autogynephilia, they don't have the exact same presentation. Phil Illy thinks that there's enough sort of like broader similarities that they're sort of like the inverse of each other. It's just that the female version of it doesn't take on an explicitly fetishistic component. It's more like a sort of romantic idealization as opposed
Okay.
to a fetishistic idealization.
Mm. I have heard it described differently in the sense of AGP, or you're attracted to yourself being a woman, but then autoandrophilia. I keep tripping up over myself with all these words, but that I've heard it described more as women who are attracted to the idea of having gay sex.
Yes, I think that is part of that is these sort of, and Phil sort of knows this phenomenon better than I do. But yeah, I think there's sort of like a sort of envy of the the sort of gay relationship. But I think
Right.
it might be I've heard people say it's slightly different than like the fetishistic component because to some extent being young girls, being young females, they're sort of indoctrinated via misogynistic conceptions of relationships where the males are always in a more powerful relationship. So they sort of, want to escape from misogyny by imagining being in a relationship where they're on the equal, like two males are like equal in the relationship. So it's a way to sort of escape from the stereotypes around, sort of being in a traditionally hierarchical relationship where the male is like the dominant one and the female is like plays the subservient role. So
Yeah.
it's sort of a desire to equalize that, and that becomes like a romantic idealization essentially.
Yeah. I mean, it must sound so whack to anyone listening who's just never heard of this stuff, but it's interesting is like, I mean, I say that in good faith, of course, but um, it's also what you just described. It's like AGP is the reverse because I have seen testimonies from people, trans women who have transitioned, and they talk about, you know, um, having this propensity towards sort of misogyny towards themselves or like being abused, kind of, debased. So it's almost like the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that is so if you watch sissy porn, which is a
Yeah.
category of, pornography that is very common, and there is a sissy to trans pipeline for sure. And even though people won't admit this because it's very taboo to talk about, but the sort of the fetishization of being degraded by, alpha males is a very common motif in this style of pornography. And people say like, oh, that's just for sissies. However, like all these categories of pornography are blended together now. So there's like trans porn, there's femboy porn, there's sissy porn, there's cross-dresser porn, and they're all sort of blended together into sort of an amorphous, fuzzy category. And I wouldn't say there's a clear boundary between these things. And
Right.
superficially, they look all the same because you have, femboy porn stars on hormones. And these sort of like taking hormones and transitioning becomes a fetish in and of itself. Like the transition process itself becomes part of the fetish because it sort of is the ultimate emasculation of your maleness to go on the hormones. And so people can fetishize taking hormones. And then I think what often happens is once you actually go on the hormones and once you actually start living this lifestyle full time, it becomes normalized and the hormones kill your testosterone, which kills your libido. So now you sort of don't have that libidinal energy flowing through you. So it sort of all becomes normalized and this sort of fetishistic aspect goes away and your sort of trans identity as a sort of like more of an idea becomes
Right.
dominant. And this is what a lot of trans women will say. It's like, well, AGP can't be correct because even if, when I first started, I had a euphoria boner. Once I started hormones and once I took my trans identity on, once I started transition, like I never get aroused it, it anymore. But that's compatible
Yeah.
with AGP because AGP is a theory of the origins of the transition process.
Right.
And it's not a theory that says the fetishistic arousal is 100% activated throughout the whole lifetime of being a trans
Really.
woman. And the other key problem with this theory is it doesn't explain the homosexual transsexual type who never experiences any of this fetishistic aspect at all. So if they say like, oh, we're just, women and, we're just being women and like regular women, have these sexual fantasies, that's just normal for women to have. Well, the homosexual variant, AKA trans women who have been exclusively attracted to men their whole lives, they don't experience any of this stuff. So
Yeah.
it doesn't explain why there's a difference based on what's your what's your sexuality relative to your birth sex. And that
Mm.
is what the key theory is, that there's a difference between these two types. There's the types of trans women who have always been attracted to men, and then there's everyone else, which includes
Yeah.
asexuals, bisexuals, and exclusive heterosexuals. And so the
Mm.
sort of like saying like, oh, well, this is just normal stuff for, women to experience, like can't explain why the homosexual types never experience this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's wild how different the two are because, you know, if I had to bet my best theory on why trans women of the homosexual variety transition, it's like, when you're gay, like I am, lots of us are gender non-conforming to a certain degree, right? And if a man is so hyper feminized, there's sort of no way that it's very difficult for him to walk through life and walk through society without going into issues. And I mean, facing so much discrimination and feeling so it's difficult when you're a man, but you can't see any other men that you can actually see yourself in. Like there's no one to empathize with you or no one you can look up to say, oh, that's like me. But instead, you can definitely find that in women. So it's like all of that. Can lead to this dysphoric, very unhappy feeling about your body and that you're not in the right place. I mean, that would be my best kind of guess, even though I'm not of any sort of scientific background. But I sort of feel like the homosexual variety is almost, very much, very heavily dependent on society and how society deals with gender nonconformity. Whereas, your type or the AGP type is, you could almost look at it as more biological.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I can't, I'm not homosexual, so I can't put myself in that mind. So you're much, better able to speak, but that totally makes sense in terms of like, there's sort of there's a natural femininity that is not like learned, whereas the AGP type, at
Yeah.
least in my own experience, I'll tell you, like when I first, so I wasn't naturally overly feminine as a young child. I was never made fun of as a sissy. I was, kind of a typical rough and tumble boy growing up that, you would have never thought I was like an effeminate child as like a young boy. Whereas I think the homosexual type is that sort of like very effeminate boy that's
Mm-hmm.
made fun of for being a sissy.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the AGP, I think a lot of the femininity is sort of it doesn't come out of an innate it doesn't come out of an innate sense of being effeminate. It comes out of like it's sort of like you learn it through observation. So when I started my transition, I
Right.
sort of self-consciously started a process of observing and imitating femininity such that, I would sort of observe how, you know, stereotyped, versions of femininity, like how males and females sort of act differently in stereotyped forms. And then I like learned to imitate that essentially. And I imitated it well enough that it eventually sort of became, more natural to me. For example, with like speaking. So, trans women have to train their voice. Well,
Yeah.
obviously, some trans women AGPs never train their voice, and they kind of like take on a more typical male monotone, deep voice intonation. But you can train to like imitate, like more stereotypical upswing, and it becomes a very like I sort of learned and studied it, so it didn't come naturally to me. I
Yeah.
studied it, which I think is the key difference between the homosexual type and the AGP type. And I think I don't want to be overly binary with this distinction because I think there are some AGPs, because particularly now you're starting to see more younger AGPs transition.
Mm.
I think this is partly due to the prevalence of like trans culture on the internet, femboy culture, trans culture. Like it's very prevalent on Reddit and these
Yeah.
Discord communities, and you sort of. So I think that sort of influence can happen at a younger age, and it sort of can maybe be part of like a more normal socialization process. But I do think
Right.
there is a difference because when you really know like a true homosexual type, there it's like night and day. You can kind of always tell, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. And before I knew about all this, I wouldn't have. I mean, now when I look at the media and examples of trans women, I find it quite obvious personally. Um, for many of them, I guess. Would you agree with that? I mean, when you look at well-known trans people, trans actresses, or YouTubers, just kind of anyone in the public sphere, do you get a sense of maybe which variety you're looking at?
I think it's one of the things once you see it, you can't unsee it. Um, and
Yeah.
um, like, and yeah, there are exceptions. There are always going to be exceptions, and that's what people say, like being critical of the typology. It's like, well, no, like you can't categorize millions of people into one of two boxes, and it's like, sure, granting that point, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. There's always going to be, some fuzzy boundaries, but generally speaking, it you can make a pretty broad sweeping generalization and have it hold true in most cases. And I think this is particularly true in terms of not just um, the heterosexuality, but the sort of uh, you know, forms of behaviors and interests and proclivities that are typical of the homosexual type versus the um the LGBT type. I think, like, for example, the homosexual type might be more interested in, like, makeup and cosmetology and like beauty and this sort of like, being a beauty influencer and the sort of more traditional, like, drag queen culture sort of thing. Whereas like your sort of classic stereotype of the AGP type is like the computer programmer who's on Reddit and like, has nerdy Star Trek interest or something. So that's obviously like a generalization, but I think you kind of see differences, and also, which are the type that is more prone to sex work as survival. That's like another thing you see in the community that sort of differentiate, where the AGP type, you know, are, I think, less likely to do that.
Mm, yeah. And I think it's something I struggle to get my head around, and I think many people would, is sometimes it's described as a fetish, sometimes as a sexual orientation. So in my mind, those two things are so different. And, if it is a fetish, my understanding of a fetish would be, something you enjoy sexually, but you don't need to live as that fetish. You're not kind of moving through the world, like always kind of that fetish being a part of you. Um, at least with myself, like, there's never been an aspect of me walking into the world kind of retaining part of my sexual interest. At least I hope not. I don't think there is. So I mean, what are your thoughts, first of all, on the kind of fetish theory versus sexual orientation?
Right. Well, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think if you look at the original research papers from Ray Blanchard, it was common in the literature to describe it as a paraphilic orientation.
Okay.
So I don't think they're mutually exclusive concepts. And furthermore, I think it is a narrow conception of human sexuality to suppose that a fetish is limited in scope, or must be limited in scope, such that it basically never escapes the bedroom. I
Um,
think human male sexuality is a very powerful thing, and something I've come to appreciate over the years is that I think AGP has a sort of addictive quality, such that the more
right.
you indulge in it, it sort of can take over your life. And because as a paraphilia, it involves sort of beliefs about yourself. It sort of has an impact on identity formation, such that you come to develop these beliefs. You sort of become attracted to the idea of yourself as a woman. And once you have that idea of yourself, that sort of bleeds out into a desire to instantiate that idea in all aspects of your life. And it just kind of becomes like, addicting. You sort of like little dopamine hits. And next thing you know, you're, you're cross-dressing, like on the weekends, and then you're like cross-dressing in the evenings, and then it's like 7 days a week. And next thing you know, you want to do it all the time. And then you go full time. And once you go full time, now you want to take hormones. And I think this is common to like kind of always take it to the next level, which is like it's kind of never ceasing process. It's like, okay, well, now I'm going to start hormones. Well, then I'm going to get bottom surgery. Well, now I need facial surgery, and then I need like a breast augmentation. It's sort of like you sort of you postpone your happiness via just like the continual
Pursuit.
it just becomes like a never ending thing. And I think part of it is because it has a sort of like it kind of takes over your mind. Like the first couple of years of my transition is like all I thought about was like trans stuff. Like it sort of just like consumed my entire mind. And I was just like on Reddit constantly. And I was just like, and I became a hardcore trans activist too. Like
Yeah, I
that's
was
the
gonna
other
get
thing.
into
Like,
that because I noticed that you've
yeah.
been on quite the journey. But I guess yeah, before you go on that, what was I gonna ask you? Yeah, I guess I hear from, the gender critical movement, like they'll kind of make sweeping statements like there's no proof that anyone transitioning can make them happier, and actually everyone feels worse. Now, particularly with the homosexual variety, you know, I hear straight from people's mouths, I'm so happy, I have a great life. And I think the authenticity shines true for them. I do believe that transitioning has really helped them. So with people with autogynephilia, do you really believe that they can achieve, happiness in that way? I mean, what was that like for you?
Um, I mean, yeah, I was generally a well-adjusted, happy person. Like my life like didn't go down the tubes when I transitioned. Like, I managed to have many satisfying relationships. And I eventually met my wife, who I'm still married to and in a very happy relationship with. I found a terrific career and which I'm still in. And
Okay.
so in many respects, like I had a good life, and I definitely think it's possible to sort of and like kind of take AGP to the maximal conclusion and transition and like come out on the other end generally more well adjusted and happy compared to the previous version, which is why you know and this is where it gets complicated in terms of like the politics of it all, in terms of like how much gatekeeping to put into to the transition process.
Mm,
And for adults, I think the pediatric transition question is a totally separate topic, and we don't
yeah,
even
I agree.
necessarily need to get into that because I know it's very controversial.
Mm,
But for adults, I generally lean towards reasonable gatekeeping, with the caveat that I ultimately think that it is up to adults to make decisions for their lives based on their own conception of what is the best life for them in a liberal free society that is pluralistic, because there are some value systems out there that sort of perceive the whole enterprise of transition as basically a moral depravity.
yeah.
And so that's a very conservative perspective, which
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily going to say that like I can prove that that's wrong, because we're getting to morality and values, and like how do you prove a value system? You sort of it comes about our presuppositions and our worldviews and like what we take to be authoritative in regards to the determination of like what makes for a good life. And for some people, it's not necessarily just do whatever you desire. For some, it's like adhering to a more you know absolutist moral code that's defined by some conservative authority. And I'm
Okay.
not like, I don't want to say like, oh, like you must be a terrible big bigot if you believe that. However, we live in a pluralistic society where there are many competing value systems out there.
Yeah.
Some are more liberal and hedonistic. Some are more conservative. And so I think liberalism and allowing adults to make decisions, like we allow adults to walk down to the liquor store and potentially get themselves addicted to alcohol and destroy their lives. And that is not a good thing for them to do, but we allow them to do it because we live in a free society and people have free will. And I think you can just make these decisions about how your life goes. And so long as we are protecting people who can't give informed consent because maybe they're children, um,
Yeah.
that's sort of my big perspective is like, and I do think people can choose this for themselves and like be happier, but
Mhm.
um, I don't think that's
And
the
the
pertinent question.
yeah. So I very much agree with you, and I'm never here to say people should or should not transition except for kids, which I very much think they should not. But um, I guess if I'm imagining myself to be a woman, then if it was well understood by myself that there are these different types of trans women and one is a more fetishistic nature, then I think naturally I would feel more uncomfortable sharing spaces with those than maybe the other type. And I don't say that in a judgmental way. I think it's very important. I don't know if you'd agree, but to kind of raise awareness of AGP and the kind of compassion that needs to go with it, because it can be quite debilitating, I've heard. But what would be your reasoning behind that? Because, even though we're in this pluralistic society and it's like it's up to you if you want to transition, but then potentially making women uncomfortable in their spaces when they're sort of aware of the intentions behind it.
Right. Um, so this is a really tough question, and I don't pretend to have the entire answer. I think,
Yeah.
you know, to some extent, I don't necessarily believe that in a liberal society we ought to outlaw the expression of this public in the public square, so to speak, provided that you are otherwise following decency laws. Like, are your are your genitals covered? Are you, you know, in some respect, covering yourself up the way we expect any other adult to cover themselves up? And we have to sort of rely on implicit mechanisms of social ostracization through shame or other forms of social control to prevent the most egregious forms of this from operating in public. For example, like if you're a diaper wearing age play fetishistic walking in the mall sucking on a baby bottle, freaking children out, and like
I feel like
maybe
you're referring to an actual video, which I think I've
yes,
seen.
I am.
A good example.
However, so so there's one question like what do we do in the public square? Just walking on the sidewalk where everyone has a right to walk in the sidewalk. Like, but that is a totally separate question from things like single sex spaces, women's prisons, sports. And that is where I think the AGP mindset, in my experience and observation of this, they tend to have a very self centered, narcissistic, ethical system such that they say, like, well, it would make me feel bad to not get the thing that I want because I want in order to live out, to maximize the instantiation of my identity as a woman, I feel like it is my prerogative. I desire to go into these female spaces and to otherwise be treated like a female, just like everyone else. Because if I am not treated like a 100% as a female as everyone else, then like that makes me feel bad. So, so there's kind of two ethical questions. One is like, what do we do with the expression of this fetish in these sort of like, general common space versus like, you know, dealing with single sex spaces, like single sex changing rooms, like, like should, a fully intact male like Leah Thomas be able to walk into a single sex changing room and just get naked because there's a sort of like idea in gender identity theory that, if you have a certain gender identity, you are more or less, for all intents and purposes, like perfectly equivalent to a
Yeah.
female. So you have every prerogative to, be treated legally speaking as a, female, which I definitely understand why many females would not be comfortable with that. And I think, there's legitimate ethical questions as the gender critical movement has raised in regards to these
Mhm.
specific issues, like prisons, single sex changing spaces, bathrooms, etc. Now, the objection I think that always comes up is with the AGP is that, well, most AGPs are just regular people who aren't these like, that they're not they're not walking in, with like a boner or anything. They're just sort of like regular people. And I think that is true for the most part in terms of the vast majority of AGPs, in my opinion, are not, predatory. They're not, going to do any harm, but the sort of general ethical principle is like, in regards to
Mm,
safeguarding, is like, given that this comes out of the male population, and given that, there is some statistics and facts that I've seen. I think Kathleen Stock has brought up some of these statistics in regards to looking at the general propensity for sexual offense
yeah.
crimes in the male population. And then the question is like, is there any reason, any evidence to believe that AGP trans women are significantly different relative to that baseline of propensity, even if it's a smaller percentage? Like, let's say most AGPs are not more predisposed, given that they're males. Like, and the thing is like, given with gender identity theory, you can't say that's about passing, because you can't say like, oh, only if you pass 100%, you're allowed in the women's room, because like for the most part, that's hard to enforce, and it's a high standard, and like most
Yeah.
trans women would not meet that standard. But it's like, if it's not about passing, what's the bar? Like, if what if you are just started your transition and you have barely had laser hair removal, so now you have like slight beard shadow, and like you're kind of visibly male, but you're making a decent effort. Like, how much effort do you have to put in to consider to be passable enough to not cause a commotion in like these
Yeah.
spaces? And so that's the sort of, so the gender criticals just want to say like, no, we just want to make a general rule: if you're male, don't go in those spaces, because we can't police like who might be a predator, who might not be a predator. Or then they'll say, well, there's no evidence that there's like, increased like crime relative to this. So you can't prove that this is actually like a problem. Well, I think that's fallacious, because Leah Thomas definitely walked into the single sex female changing room fully intact and like upset those females, but those females didn't report a crime, but it doesn't mean they weren't bothered
Yeah.
or harmed by that experience. So you can't look at like, the incidence of crime statistics to determine whether or not this is causing like more problems in society, because the vast majority of
Mm,
this stuff is going unreported, if it is causing a problem at all. And women are trained via, empathy, to sort
right.
of just accept it, to like, oh, like I can't speak up because, I'm going to be a bigot. My liberal friends will like think I'm a terrible person if I speak up about this,
Yeah.
even if it makes me uncomfortable. So I think
It's
that's
such a
like the
great
tricky
point. I
part.
think this stuff must happen more than we care to know. I mean, even just, I'm not saying that this obviously happens, more in AGP people, but you're right in saying any man, regardless of their identity, is of a higher risk. It doesn't matter if they're trans or not in that sense. But even violence towards women by, just cis straight men, um, a lot of those don't get reported. So who knows, like how many of these things that happen, especially that if it is a trans woman that's done something, it's almost more taboo because, like you said, people fear being accused of, being a bigot, being discriminatory. And I think I have compassion for both sides, but I guess it comes back to how I feel, how I can empathize with the gender critical side is even taking, violence or safeguarding issue aside. I think if someone just isn't very comfortable with a male being in a space, then I also think that they have a right to feel that way, you know? Um, it doesn't mean that I don't have compassion for the other
Right.
side. I guess I just wish that it was more socially acceptable in society for it to have a third space, and that trans people were just very happy to use that. I think it would be so much. It's obviously me not being trans, thinking of it too simplistically, right? But it feels like it could be the only option where everyone's sort of getting what they want. Although you can argue the trans AGP women just really are not getting
Right.
what they want.
Yeah, a lot of trans people would say like, "Oh, like, what are you're othering me. You're like, you're putting me in a third category. I don't accept that. I'm 100% a woman, and it's bigoted to say otherwise." But I think, so they say like, we're a marginalized group. We're being oppressed, and so therefore we want to prioritize the marginalized group. So it becomes
Yeah.
like a game of like oppression Olympics. But if we're going to consider equality in terms of like, okay, we're respecting the beliefs of these marginalized communities. Well, there are religious communities, for example, Orthodox Jews or Muslims, who they don't believe in this gender ideology stuff. So it's about your biological sex.
Yeah.
God made you male and female. And so they don't believe that your identity trumps that. And they have specific Orthodox like prohibitions about being in a single sex space
Hmm.
with a male. So now you have the liberal, progressive, trans women who are saying, my rights as a minority, because I have this gender identity, trump that of this other marginalized community
Yeah.
of Orthodox female Jews or whatever, like, and saying like, oh, well, their religious beliefs to not be in a single sex space with males, like, because they don't believe that, identity can trump like a, God-given like
Hmm.
biological category. So now whose belief is true? Like, you have competing ideological worldviews. And I think you sort of, yeah, I would totally advocate for third spaces, but I think some of the narcissism in the trans community sort of says like, our concerns as a marginalized group trump every other marginalized community. Like our concerns are more important, which is sort of like, I think it's a lack of empathy in terms of thinking
Yeah.
from other people's perspectives that might be impacted by this conflict of rights. Because at the bottom of it, you have a conflict of rights, and who gets to decide whose rights trump? Because you can't square the circle and make everyone happy. So you have to make up a general policy. Um,
Mm. And I guess, taking discrimination aside, but logically to me, it feels more logical to base a policy on objective biological reality than, a subjective internal reality, because there's one you can prove and one you cannot, right? But why do
right.
you feel that we have
Well,
this? Sorry, go on.
Uh, I was just gonna say, like, at this point, a lot of trans activists will say, like, oh, well, if you try and like, divide all this up based on biological categories, do you want like trans men to go into the women's locker room? And well,
Yeah,
no, because
no,
I think we can be more precise in how we delineate policy because it is the females at risk of male violence, whereas the trans man going into the male bathroom, that's probably what they want to do anyway, and they are they are not a threat to males. Like a trans man, a female with a male identity is not a threat to males. Whereas if it's not a symmetrical relationship such that trans men pose an equal violence risk for attacking like males versus, the other way around. So you can craft a policy that specifically protects, you know, f- female spaces. Just
right,
like we have protections that are sex-based, like females, need private spaces for breastfeeding. Well, oh, that's discriminatory because it's, why don't males get their own space for breastfeeding? Because they don't breastfeed. So it's like it is okay to craft policies that are sex specific because males and females have different needs because males and females are
yeah,
different. So that's what I would say.
yeah, and I would agree definitely in terms of safety. I think the only thing I'd push back on is, there may be men who just simply, there are lots of men who may be embarrassed to be in the same changing room as someone they know to be a woman. I mean, I live in London, so it's quite a, cosmopolitan liberal society I live in, and I love that. I've been in some changing rooms where I've seen, at the gym, I've seen trans men, so I've seen the top surgery scars, and to me, I don't care at all. But I mean, I could understand why some men might be uncomfortable, or if they have a certain religion that means they can't be unclothed in front of
Yeah.
someone, then that makes sense. I know they were probably thinking of quite
Yeah.
niche
Yeah.
examples, but yeah,
Yeah. No, I think it's a fair point. And also I'd be curious your thoughts on this as like, a gay man in terms of like, I've heard from some gay men that like, the they sort of like have a desire to have, spaces that are exclusive to males. So for example, you're not gonna be at risk of getting anyone pregnant if it's like, if it's like a exclusively male space. And so I could see that as being something that would be desirous, but
Yeah.
so I don't think it's necessarily only, so I think the gender identity, um, you know, uh, I, I, ideology, like it generalizes. So I don't think it's purely just like a female issue.
For sure. I mean, I support trans people, and I think, um, given especially if the treatment processes were more robust with, lots of therapy first, I think potentially you might see a lot less people transitioning and finding a way to be happy. But I think for those who do not achieve that, then I very much support it. But I guess as a gay man, I know how long it took us to fight for our rights, and even I've talked about this on my channel, like, from the period of 2018 to 2020, my nightlife scene kind of went from very much being like gay men, which is its own thing and it's great, has its pros and cons, like everything. But then now everything has to be queer, and it's like it has its own aesthetic. It has its own political movement, belief system. It's kind of more, it's a lot, everything's more about gender now than it is about just being two men who have a certain sexuality. So I think it would be nice if we could have both, because we obviously have these scenarios in which, people try and set up a gay only event, and then they say, but this actually means just only males or only females, not just trans people. And then, there was a lesbian speed dating event. I don't know if you've heard of it, in London, that got shut down, um, because of, a trans identifying male wanting to be part of it. And they said no. So I think that's just something that really gets my back up. And, I'll support you as long as your rights don't infringe on mine. And I personally find it insulting if, a trans man claims to be gay and to have that experience, because the reality is that we don't have the same experience. And, I don't think you're gay. I think you're your own thing. And I think there's beauty in that. But I guess it always goes hand in hand with this. People who transition, some of them really do want to be seen as 100% that thing. Otherwise, it's not enough.
Yeah. Well, I think this is where gender identity theory has sort of veered off course relative to the other sort of traditional civil rights movements in regards to, trying to eliminate discriminations based on these sort of like, innate characteristics, because it really seems particularly unique to gender identity ideology that it's not just like that you would have to treat people nice and treat them with love, because I definitely would support, being loving and kind and empathetic and, showing compassion for people who are clearly suffering psychological distress over this, condition. Because I think gender dysphoria, this sort of like, you know, wanting to harm your body based on these desires, I mean, but, like, we, you have to accept their interpretation of reality. Otherwise, you're a bigot, you're transphobic, you're doing harm to them by not believing what they believe, which is, I think, it sort of becomes very Orwellian, such that even me describing that as harm is now a transphobic act of speech violence that I have committed.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it has to be,
so
right?
it becomes,
Otherwise they can't
yeah.
shut you down.
Yeah, and so it's this sort of like cancellation culture intrinsic to this movement that I find particularly worrisome for just basic free speech, the basic prerogative to have differences of opinion about certain worldview presuppositions, and this idea that the trans perspective is the one true worldview. And if you don't believe that worldview, you are a terrible person who must not have any love in their heart, and you must just be a purely hateful person, even though, you can have love and empathy and compassion for someone while having a totally different set of axioms and presuppositions that form your worldview that influence how you see the world. But now it's like, oh, like there's this like automatic knee-jerk reaction to say it's a thought terminating cliche to say like, oh, well, you don't believe my worldview, so you must be a bigot. And I think that sort of way of viewing things is it's such a troubling precedent in a
Yeah.
otherwise pluralistic society where you're never going to have worldview alignment. Like there's
Mm-mm.
going to be basic presuppositions and axioms that are like fundamentally different, and the sort of like yeah. So that's my big
Yeah.
concern, really.
I completely agree. I think some people can view some of these ideas as relatively kind of nebulous and, oh, what harm does it do to say trans women are women, full stop? But the issue is that once we open our doors to believing something that is not reality, it's a belief, but kind of the higher powers in government kind of actually fostering this belief in people, then that means, there's nothing they can't really do, like you can take it further and further. Um, and you can keep stretching people's beliefs, and then it does become Orwellian. I've seen your video examining how gender ideology mimics a cult, and that's the sort of tactics people need to use
Mm.
when they need you to believe something that is not based in reality. Then they need to use all of these tactics of the love bombing, the cancel culture. Anything you say in opposition to this is automatically disgraceful. And it is worrying to me because it's several things in society, obviously by and large, feel guilty about how gay and lesbian people were treated. So they're being told that this movement now is comparable, that transphobia is the same thing as homophobia, the same level of violence. Although people would probably argue now that it's worse. So they're kind of blindly accepting that for the most part, but it's a lot more complicated than that. Like one is based off just people, having this attraction, wanting to live their lives, and another is based off this kind of belief that you can't prove. And then I guess why I feel passionate about it as well is just how many gay kids are being harmed as a result of this kind of indoctrination. So it does worry me too. And I think when you're head deep in this, kind of reading about it every day, you know, um, I don't know if I'm really obsessed with this, but obviously a lot of my channel is about it. So I'm always listening to podcasts, reading books. Like it can become quite all consuming in what the hell is happening to the world and how far is this going to go.
Right. Yeah. And, it's funny because when I was a trans activist, like I used to think Jordan Peterson was like the devil, terrible bigot, terrible transphobe. But I think he was right on the money all those years ago when he blew up and got popular based on like the Canadian, free speech law saying like it is a crime to misgender someone, basically. And he was
Yeah.
right on the money because his opposition was like, well, it's not that I don't want to be polite, it's not that I don't want to be kind, and like, if someone's really suffering, if they would just have a terrible, if it would ruin their day because I don't use this pronoun for them, then like, yeah, like I'm okay with like doing that out of like politeness. But if you're gonna like make it illegal, if you're gonna make it a crime for me, you're gonna compel my speech. It's like if I don't say this thing, then I'm now a criminal who's like, can be legally punished by the government. That's like
It's
really
insane.
concerning. And like, so I think,
Madness.
it's easy to focus on the specifics of the transgender movement, but I always like to bring it back full picture to larger philosophical concerns about, free speech, which is like a general principle. It's not just the trans issue. It's like this is a common tactic, and wokeness broadly considered, such that there's like a certain you know intellectual lineage coming out of critical social justice theory that sort of like mandates these certain ideological worldviews as being like the correct thing to do, which just involves all sorts of thought control, essentially saying that like if you don't agree with this on these presuppositions, then like you are a terrible person. And yeah, I think that that general principle, uh, you know, uh, it generalizes beyond the trans case. But I think
Worse.
it's so
Yeah.
tricky because as soon as you start talking up about this stuff, you just get instantly rejected from polite, liberal, left of center social circles, and you just sort of get lumped in as like a terrible bigot. Oh, you must be far right, you must be conservative, you must be this, you must be that, you must be a bigot. And so that sort of, I think, creates a polarization such that you know it and
Mm.
I think it's hard to really convince people that that you don't truly hate trans people. Like you don't hate, like you you can disagree with someone's worldview without hating them. But I think it's sort of like we like no longer believe that that's possible anymore. It's like if you have a difference of worldview, you
Well, I feel like everyone must think independently of themselves. There's certain things I disagree with, but I know people will perceive me to be that hateful. Um, but you're right on the money. I think this is not exclusive to the trans movement. We've seen stuff like this in the past, like the Soviet Union, and how do we gaslight and manipulate a whole society into believing something so that we can control, we can really control these people now. So you see it crop up in so many different ways, but I guess what's very unique about this particular subject is that it's enmeshed with the
right.
civil rights movement, you
Yeah,
know?
and they'll use this language of being on the right side of history. It's a very moralistic campaign. It's like the sort
Yeah.
of using morality as a bludgeon to say that, our perception of morality is the correct one, which is an assumption that they have access to the objective moral truth, which is so ironic to me because usually when you push them on morality, you sort of dig a little deeper, they're sort of very much like relativist about everything else when it comes to morality. It's like, oh, there's no objective moral truth because we're like, postmodern, and it's all just we're just projecting. We're projecting meaning on a meaningless universe, and we're just like living
Yeah.
our truth. And you can't say my truth is worse than your truth. So it comes down to relativism. But they say, like, if you disagree with me on this topic, then you must be a terrible bigot and you're on the wrong side of moral history, even though there is no ultimate moral truth. So it's like, it's a sort of like deeply contradictory.
Well, all
Yeah.
all of it contradicts itself. It's the same with the whole social justice movement in that, gender is socially constructed, but then all the things that we try and, spread out in society is based on sex stereotypes. And we see it the same with racism, white privilege, microaggressions, putting people in all these different boxes is supposed to be making us more colorblind as a society, but instead it's just separating us more and leaving white people walking on eggshells, terrified of saying the wrong thing. And we are all afraid to be branded as these things. Since I started my channel, I've had large groups of people actually cut me out of their lives, and it was sort of expected. God knows why I'm doing this, because I've always just been a risk taker, and when I see something isn't right and unjust, and for some reason I feel like I have to talk about it, so I'm not going to stop. But you have to kind of accept that these things will happen, and I just think the more we can learn as a society that even if a group is marginalized and a minority, we can still question things they say and ways that they tell us, I'm oppressed, I'm a minority, which may be true. Therefore, this is how I need to be treated. I think we should still be able to push back on some of these
Yeah.
ideas,
No, I agree. It's a one thing to recognize genuine prejudice that comes out of actual animosity towards a person, sort of the dehumanization of like, you are vermin, you are scum, you don't deserve, basic human rights that are afforded to other rights in a liberal democratic society. That's one thing. We can recognize those historical injustices like done in terms of that genuine prejudice that does exist. And I do want to say that there are plenty of people in these sort of like anti-trans, anti or gender critical movement who genuinely do seem to have a lot of mean-spiritedness in their heart, who sort of like spend their time sort of like,
yeah,
just really not talking about ideas, but like attacking people, sort of not showing love, I think. And so I think it's really something that I would want to embody in my own sort of like discussions about this is I hope it, that I'm showing kindness to people, even if I disagree with their worldviews. But that is such a different conception of like how discrimination and prejudice plays out in society historically versus the sort of move we see in the critical social justice theories, which is a totalizing narrative, such that there's these like abstract forces of, transphobia or white supremacy or patriarchy, and there's these like, or there's these like broad totalizing narratives that sort of impose like this, like you can never opt out of it. It doesn't matter how nice you are, how loving you are. It doesn't matter if you've never committed a single act of discrimination or prejudice in your life. You are just as bad as the KKK. You are just as bad as like the neo-Nazis. Like you
Yeah.
can't opt out of your of these things. So you're just like a fascist no matter what. You can never not be a fascist if you disagree with them on this stuff because it's a totalizing narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like there's no scale. It's like you can compare having dreadlocks to attacking a black person. Like those two things are sort of, they'll be labeled as the same thing. And so many people have bought into this. I mean, someone said to me recently, I basically said that the concept of homophobia, transphobia, racism have become so broad, they've lost all meaning. We really need to keep it exclusive to, just like you said, um, situations where there's a genuine animosity and, infringement on these people's rights or cause of harm, all of that stuff. But this person said, um, but no, racism is so much broader than that. And I'm white. So if someone tells me something is racist, then, it must be. And I'm like, what
Yeah.
kind of, what are we, how can you ever like have a belief where someone of a certain type can just tell you something is true and you're just going to blindly accept? I mean, like, how do people not see the issues with that? Just staring them in the face.
Right. I mean, that's one of the basic principles of, how this sort of like woke critical social justice works is like only trans people can define transphobia. And if you're cis, then like you don't
Yeah.
get to define transphobia. So now it's like anyone can say just like the tiniest little things are, like actual hate speech. So, the example I always like to use is like it is considered deeply transphobic to if you're typing out the word trans woman, if you don't put a space between trans and woman, you're like a terrible transphobe.
Yes.
It's just like a
Yeah.
little things like that, and it's like,
Cancelled.
or and once we sort of lose grip on objectivity in regards to defining you know, how we ought to operate in a democratic, pluralistic society based on like these general principles of treating people fairly, treating people out of love. But they sort of like redefine what it means to hate someone based on things that ordinarily, would not sort of impose harm. It's like not now speech becomes harm. Like the mere fact if someone has like Zzer pronouns and you don't use Zzer pronouns, you're literally committing hate speech, which is an act of violence. And they always
Yeah,
say like, well, you're increasing the likelihood of suicide or something. So,
of
therefore
course.
that's like, this hate speech is causing a rise of mental, illness or something. And it's like yeah,
Yeah, the whole concept that we have to be responsible for other people's mental
right.
health in that way, doesn't make any sense either. And it is insane to me, I'm 29, so it's not like I'm ancient, like, and it was only 10 years ago, I was still a teenager and suffering actual homophobia. And now it's like, how have we got here so fast? But I know we've been talking for a long time, Ray, but there's a couple of things I'd still really like to know. Obviously, you ended up detransitioning, and I can only imagine that being led to transition, something kind of consumes your life so much you need to do it. So, how are you in a place now where you're able to be happy in your, natal sex. And what would have helped you back then to kind of help you manage it? Like, would that have been possible back then for you?
So in terms of being happy with my natal sex, I think it comes down to this idea of like integrity, such that I sort of feel much more holistic and the total conception of who I am. There's not like this duality between like who I want to be and how I present. So, and when I was trans identified, I didn't pass like 100%. And so, I would kind of live in this ambiguous state where, I might get gendered female before I open my mouth. So I'm kind of like always worrying, like, how are people perceiving me? How are people, understanding me? Like, do I have to like keep my guard up or whatever? And it's sort of like this hyper self-consciousness, such that I'm always, I was worried about being misgendered, and like, if I did get misgendered, like, it sort of caused a lot of like self-induced neuroticism and anxiety based on this like idea to pass. And that kind of like, mellowed out eventually, but it's kind of like an overwhelming background anxiety that was kind of there and like humming in the background at all times, is sort of like fear of like how I'm being perceived in terms of, causing the stress. Whereas now detransition, like, well, one of the main motivators, besides a bunch of health problems I had from the hormones, which, I can talk about that, but now there's sort of this integration in terms of like, I don't have to be anything other than who I am. And there's a sort of integrity between my whole range of expression. I don't have to keep my voice register at this like artificially pitched thing. I can kind of have my full range of expression. I can sort of like, you know, there's so many aspects in terms of like being embodied in my male self and accepting myself and developing a positive conception of a man and masculinity. And I think that's what would have helped, in addition to just learning about AGP back then, and like, truly understanding what is the cause of these feelings, what is the cause of these desires. Whereas now I have a much more healthy understanding of like where it all comes from, and I'm able to contextualize it. And recognizing that now with a different moral conception, I sort of have a new understanding, such that just because I have these desires doesn't mean it's necessarily good for me to like and like indulge in them. Because
Right.
after I detransitioned, I was, sort of, I still had this sort of these AGP desires. I would just kind of do it like around the house or whatever. But I ended up realizing that it was causing like a conflict in my marriage. Just that, sort of like splitting my libidinal energies between like my wife and like this, this still like AGP. And now that the testosterone was back, it's sort of like all that same stuff was coming back in terms of like the fetishistic, like addictive indulgence. And so I sort of eventually realized that it is okay to repress like a desire. It is not always going to psychologically be unhealthy to repress a desire if it's like causing you to not live up to your otherwise obligations to, for me in my case, like maximize the goodness of like my, relationship with my wife. And so you know, I first tried to kind of integrate my AGP stuff into my male identity, whereas now I'm just like, just sort of not doing that. And like, it is possible to like, to not give in,
And
give into it.
does it cause you distress to sort of put that away?
No, it doesn't cause me to stress, because the goodness of like, I've realized that it is okay, like there's a sort of benefit to self-sacrificing that desire to give in to that in order to maximize my obligations to do what's right for
Yeah.
my relationship. Because I realized that the more I indulged in the AGP, the less satisfying my sex life was with my wife. Because like like it's just like it can't compete with AGP because it's so hyper sexualized. It's so hyper fetishistic that it was sort of like
Yeah.
causing an unhealthy like sexual addiction. Essentially, I was like enslaved to this basically. So like
Mm.
learning that like I can actually,
Yeah.
like I don't have to do that. And I think if I had been aware that it's possible to have these desires and not necessarily give into them, and that's not going to cause me to be this terribly repressed person who's struggling all the time, because, I think there's this idea that, oh, if you have, you know, these sexual desires, that it's always like you must like, you know, um, live them out. So,
Yeah. Because I guess when you first described it, it almost sounds reminiscent of, a gay person having to repress the fact they're gay in order to live a successful life, like a conversion therapy type thing. But then I actually hear a lot in what you're saying mirrored in the gay community in terms of it's rare now to find two men who are in a monogamous relationship. And I am, and I'm very happy. I've been in it 4 years. And it's just like you said, there's a level of commitment to that, and there's a level of sacrifice you have to accept in order to have this great experience. But I've seen so many men that are not able to even attempt giving that up because they need to be having sex all the time. And, some of them, it becomes debilitating in terms of getting into the chemsex
right.
kind of environment and, like an addictive thing. So I can really
Yeah.
see the similarities
Yeah.
there, and it's not like for you to sacrifice this thing for the sake of your marriage doesn't mean you're miserable,
Right.
but it means that you're getting something pure, and that's something
Right.
that's
And it's
great.
not just AGP itself. It's not, because that's a sort of, it's also, masturbation and pornography, which is having a negative impact on the goodness of what I was able to give to my wife. So giving up on those things, like, and I think in some respects in our culture, there's this like idea that like, oh, well, if you have that desire, it must be good to do it because you're not hurting anyone. Well, it's like, no, it's hurting my wife because, like the more I, masturbated and like looked at pornography, the more addicted that became, and like the less that took away from what I was able to give to my wife. But yeah, so I think, these sorts of conversations are not popular in our culture, because there's this sort of like, I think there's a sort of basic assumption of like hedonism, where like hedonistic self-centered pleasure is like always an absolute moral good, and like any restriction on that hedonistic self-pleasure in order to sacrifice for a committed relationship is,
Yeah.
bad. So, they'll say like, well, yeah, if it comes natural to me to want to masturbate, so therefore it must be good, even if like that's causing me, it's detracting from my marriage. People will hear this and say like, oh, you're just a prude. You're just repressed. You're just repressing. And it's like, that's okay. I can think that, but it's working for me, and I'm feeling a lot more integrated and, positive than I was when I was sort of struggling with this duality of like, trying to have a secretive AGP masturbatory life, like that was sort of like done in privacy, and then also trying to, you know, have a heterosexual marriage with my
Yeah.
wife that was, maximizing, my ability to give to her, like, the full commitment of like, so,
Mm.
but yeah, I like totally recognize that this is not a popular thing to talk about. Like
But
people
I mean,
will,
it's so logical, and well, I think any man can relate to the concept of having to make these sacrifices. If they want a successful marriage, it just is what it is. Especially if a marriage moves, decades in, and there's not as much lust there, then there needs to be a level of sacrifice. And it's something that really breaks my heart. Is just these stories of trans widows who have to go through this like very traumatic experience of their once husbands now identifying as women, and it's all about the husband. It's all about the trans woman. It's all about them.
yeah,
It's like, you're so brave. It must be so crippling and difficult for these women. Um, so I have one more question, right? Kind of on the topic of being a hardcore trans activist, because I think what's very interesting about your story is that, you know, if I'm right, only kind of this time a year ago, you were still in that frame of mind. Am I right in saying that?
Yep.
To now being a
Yep.
detransitioner, and then
Hmm.
you've also, I think, got back in touch with your Christianity. So, what
Yes.
what broke you out of the trans? Would you say you were a hardcore trans activist, like believing in all of these truths?
Um, I mean, I was pretty deep into it. I like always sort of marched to the beat of my own drama to some extent. So I didn't buy into the full blown discourse in every respect. I was kind of skeptical of, some aspects of gender identity theory, but, you know, I thought it was like anathema to, positively seek out, opinions that were counter to the prevailing narrative out of fear of being ostracized and canceled and considered a bigot. Like I had sort of programmed myself to this idea that I have a moral obligation to stay in my echo chamber. And if I start
Right.
going to look at gender critical stuff with an open mind, because that's the thing, like I never had an open mind until my wife started doing research into this on her own. And then I started actually listening to gender critical content with an open mind, whereas like previously I was always listening to it with an strong ideological confirmation bias of like, I know it must be wrong. So I'm going to like not listen to it with an open mind. And once I started like
Yeah.
allowing myself to just like listen to what people are saying, um, and I started listening to detransition narratives, and I sort of like saw that, yeah, like you can detransition and like not live a terrible life of regret. And it's not always about regret. Sometimes it's just like, a new development on your life journey. And that's kind of how I initially conceptualized it in terms of like, oh, I'm just like, going on another gender journey, but, towards like
Yeah.
the like back to my male self. But now I really developed a positive conception of myself as a male and like embrace like that it is a good thing to it's not a bad thing to be male or to be a man, whereas like I kind of had always kind of bought into that like kind of like, oh, masculinity is toxic and it's like terrible and like you should be like ashamed of being a man, especially like a white, straight man, like um
Yeah. Something I
and
used to
then
think as
once I
well.
started yeah and then once I started questioning these beliefs, like, a lot of my other beliefs that were correlated with this, sort of, started like it all started unraveling. And I've gone through a lot of worldview reconfigurations, in very short order.
Big
And
time.
that's still going on. I'm still exploring things, but
You don't mind me saying it, it might be easy for someone to assume that maybe you have a proclivity towards kind of buying quite deeply into an ideology, because I've never seen someone go from one post to the next. I completely respect it. I'm not here to invalidate anything, but what are your thoughts on that?
oh yeah, people say like, oh, you were in one ideology, now you're in another ideology. Particularly with like the Christianity stuff, people, sort of say you went from one cult to another cult. It's like, and I don't know, like, people are welcome to that belief, and I'm happy to like talk about it. But I think ultimately, I think the proof positive of that belief system is like how it manifests in the transformation of my own life to make me a better man, better husband, better person, and like more loving. And if like this belief
Yeah.
system, sort of contradicts that desire to be more Christ-like and how I, interact with the world, then I would say they have every right to criticize me for that belief system. And I think that, it's absolutely, people's
Right.
prerogative to be skeptical of Christianity, given the, historical harms that it's done. But
Mm,
at the same time, I pursue truth where I see it. And I think changing your mind is a good thing, so long as you're doing so based on
agreed.
the following the evidence where it leads you. And I think there's sort of a prevailing narrative that you couldn't possibly have any rational or evidential reason for believing in, Christianity. So, which I don't
Yeah.
think that's true. I think it can be rationally defended, but,
Mm.
yeah, I mean,
Well,
this is another one of those things that's not like, it's not like cool or popular to talk about. Like kind of,
well, we're not here to. I'm not cool or popular, so here's the right forum for it. And I guess I mean, as kind of more of a libertarian mindset, I just think it doesn't matter what you believe in. If it helps you, it's great, and if it doesn't harm people, it's the most important part. If it doesn't harm yourself or harm other people, then I don't see an issue with it at all. And just being free to believe what we want to believe is important without that from happening. Um, I guess, Ray, my last question is, because your story is so interesting, you've sort of been enlightened in this sense, coming out of the gender cults to an extent, detransitioning yourself. What advice could you give to someone who has, a loved one who's not even trans, but is so heavily kind of in this belief system, and trying to help them consider the other side? Because I can really see what you mean playing out in people I know, in that they are actively avoiding even talking to me because it would mean that they have to now argue against these points. And I believe that it's, whether conscious or not, it's a tactic that we need to follow in order to stay in, like you said, this echo chamber. So do you have any advice for anyone who would, really like a friend to just, give them their ear?
So I really like the sports topic because I think it is the clearest way to get reality to interject and contradict this belief system, because I think a lot of people have a pretty basic natural intuition that when it regards to sports, that males and females are objectively, biologically, physiologically different, and that no amount of ideological mental gymnastics can change that. And so I like to use the sports topic just because it's kind of like a wedge. It kind of puts a crack in the totalitarianism of the gender identity theory that sort of like questions, it 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 sort of allows you to re-ground yourself in objective reality. And so I like to use the sports example that's
Yeah.
why I spent so much time on my channel really diving into the science and trying to like really
Mm.
establish like objectivity, because I think what's missing in our culture, broadly speaking, not just in the gender issue, but like there's a lack of appreciation for objectivity, and there's this sort of complacency to let postmodernism get away with the villainization of objectivity as being a product of white supremacy or something. Like, oh, like you only believe in objective truth because you're like a bigot. No, we need to fight
Mm.
that very hard.
Reality is
And like,
bigoted.
um, I think the sports issue is the best way to do that. So just
Yeah.
challenge people's intuitions, and once they get that, I think that just puts a seed in their mind that like, because there are some identity theorists, these gender identity theorists out there who are making really absurd claims about the sports issue that I think violate a lot of good liberal progressive people who don't want to be considered transphobes, and they might not be wanting to speak about this, but they might be like, oh, it's gone a little too far, and that will kind of get their mind going about like, okay, well,
Mm. Well, I mean, for me, it was very much, once that first domino fell, then I couldn't go back. But then I'm also the type of person that I didn't resist it. I was like, oh yeah, this makes sense. And then I was like, okay, wow, because I have my own story of why I bought into it all, which I will speak about. But listen, such a stimulating, incredible conversation, fascinating, your whole story, and thank you for sharing it so openly. Um, so yeah, thanks for being on my podcast. How can people find you? How can they check out, see more of you?
so I'm on Twitter and YouTube, Ray Alex Williams. If you search that, that's my user handle on both platforms. So Ray Alex Williams. And yeah, and this is fantastic. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much, Ray. Hope you have a great Sunday.